Hello, everyone, and welcome to the EDHRECast. My name is Matt. I'm your host, and joining me, as always, he's the toad to my wet sprocket. It's Dana Roach.
Wow, that was not a cut I was ready for.
I didn't think you would be, but I knew you'd appreciate it.
I did. That was a good one. Right now, if Joey's listening, he's like, what is a toad and or wet sprocket?
Both of those are things probably lost to him, but Toad is the one who hangs out with Frog, and then the wet sprocket, it's
True.
a mechanical term. But Dana, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
We are alone without supervision recording a podcast. What could possibly go wrong?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Well, we do actually have a proper episode for everyone today. We have a topic, and Dana, what are we talking about today?
We're going to talk about design trends we don't necessarily love in Magic.
Yeah, it's been a shift, but we'll get to talk about a little bit of it. It's been a big social media push lately too. But first,
Yes.
We got some quick shout outs to do. And first, we got to thank Chase, also known as Mana Curves. Thank you for all the editorial work that you do on the podcast. It is definitely appreciated.
And we also like to thank Ultimate Guard, as we are now members of Team Ultimate Guard. So if you see us at any event over the course of this year, you'll see we've got our decks in those sweet Boulder deck boxes, and we're sleeved up in katana sleeves. We can't recommend them enough. So thanks, Ultimate Guard, and you should definitely check out their products.
And if you'd like to support the show, you can do so by liking the videos here, subscribing on YouTube, subscribing to a local podcast app, or leave a review. All of those are great free ways to support the show. Or if you want, you can head to patreon.com/EDHRECast. We have patron tiers of all sorts of levels, whether you want to join our Discord community, you want to see the episodes a day early. There's all of that and more over at patreon.com/EDHRECast. And one of the tiers that everybody loves this perk, is getting the weekly patron shout out. And this week we want to give a very huge shout out to Barry Drake. That is the best dragon, which is Barry Drake. Even though it's not a full-fledged dragon, but we still appreciate Barry's support.
It definitely sounds like the most adorable card. I can just picture like a little tiny dragon, like eating raspberries or something off a bush.
Named Barry.
Just a delightful little card. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, Barry, thank you so much for the support. We definitely appreciate all of it. So let's get into the main topic then, Dana. So design trends we don't love. So let's set it up. So recently, Magic design has kind of made a few trends and a few moves in a certain direction. And one that I know, it's been all over social media, Dana. It's kind of hard to avoid,
Yes.
especially if you're on like the Magic Twitterverse especially, is the discussion about Ward. I know that Joey and I talked about it a few weeks ago, and it's kind of been a little more controversial than I think we intended it to be, but it really did take off.
It did. And let's go back and set this up a little bit by talking about like the switch to Ward in the last couple of years. So that mechanic originally has its roots way back in the Shroud mechanic. And obviously, if you've been playing a long time, you know what Shroud does. But for those that don't, it doesn't really show up very often at all anymore. Shroud just made a thing untargetable by everyone involved. If Shroud was on a card, like you would see it in Helix Pinnacle, nobody could target that permanent. The problem with Shroud was people treated it like only your opponents couldn't target it. So as a result, they made Hexproof, which was that, right? Like Hexproof was the version of Shroud that people thought Shroud was for the most part.
Well, it started out, it was, before even Shroud was a thing, was can't be targeted by spells or abilities.
Sure,
which just protected it from everything. Then Shroud, and Hexproof was the fixed Shroud, and now Ward is kind of the fixed, and I say, quote, fixed, very loosely, fixed version of Hexproof.
Right, yeah, so whereas Hexproof, your opponents couldn't target the thing, Ward is just, there's a cost associated with targeting it. So generally it's mana, but sometimes it's paying life, sometimes it's discarding a card, sacrificing a creature, whatever. It's a cost that allows you to get past it, whereas like Hexproof and Shroud, you just couldn't unless you're using some effect that removed Hexproof or Shroud. So Ward is fixed, but there's a couple problems with that fix. I guess the first one we'll talk about it isn't even that big of a deal, but it's something that has came up in a few games I've seen, and that is Ward is a cost paid after you target the thing. Mm-hmm. So I've also noticed it does lead to like weird situations in games and mistakes that you didn't really get from Hexproof. If someone went to blow up your thing with Hexproof and you're like, oh, it has Hexproof, you like rules wise, you can't target it. So it's a relatively clean thing to roll back because you can just say, well, that's not a thing you can actually do. So you can't target it with your Swords of Plowshares. Oh, okay. Well, the problem has been solved.
Yeah, yeah.
The way Ward works doesn't really work that way. It's casual. It's commander. It's pretty casual. It's pretty easy to say, well, yeah, it has Ward 2 and you don't have 2 mana. You can just not cast it. But it creates a weird situation where technically you've already done the thing and you're letting someone roll back an action that they've are already in the middle of doing if they don't have the mana to pay the ward cost.
Yeah, Ward is a triggered ability. It's not just a static ability like Hexproof where it prevents the targeting from happening. So when you target something, like you said, Dana, you can target a Ovika Enigma Goliath and oh, okay, that's cool. But are you going to pay the ward cost? And that's kind of a gotcha moment. So
right.
Especially if you play on Arena, it comes up a lot. You're able to target it, but it's a triggered ability, so you have to pay either that cost or the spell is countered. And that's one thing. That's a very important distinction between Ward and Hexproof.
I will say beyond the couple of weird interactions we talked about, Ward is a fixed Hexproof in that you can actually like do the thing. Unless you were running one of a couple cards in your deck, you just can't interact with it with Hexproof. Whereas like Ward does give you a way through. The problem with Ward, I think, is much more the implementation. Mm-hmm. They put it on things that, number one, don't necessarily need Ward, and they give it numbers that oftentimes functionally make it a Hexproof anyway.
Yeah. We've covered what Ward is. And to me, I agree, Dana. The biggest problem with Ward is you're putting Ward on either creatures that don't need it in order to be a good card, or problematic, like must answer type of commanders. I know the two biggest offenders in my mind, I think, are the new Voja, which came out, and Murders Karlov Manor, which is the elf typal commander, or Myram, which is the dragon typal commander. Both of those just are absolutely like you have to get rid of them as soon as possible type of commanders. Otherwise, you're just going to run away with the game. But they also have a way that's going to slow down any way of doing that, which makes it
right.
That's the problem right there.
Yeah, putting them on cards that are already great is something that I don't necessarily understand. I feel like it's a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. The check and balance on something being super powerful is people will want to remove that thing, and whereas like something that does a lesser effect is much more likely to not get removed. There's an inherent balance in that. And it feels like from a design perspective, they've determined that, oh, people will want to remove this very powerful thing. Therefore, we need to make that more difficult. And like, that's not, I don't think that's a solution to a problem that doesn't exist.
Yeah. If Ward were treated more as a way to push an okay card into, okay, now it's a good card. If that was the way it was used, I would understand the implementation significantly more. But I struggle to think that Roaming Throne wasn't a good card if it didn't have Ward 2. I think it would be a much more balanced card, because 4 colorless mana for Roaming Throne is going to copy the abilities of your creatures that are certain type. I get that. That is very powerful. There's Panharmonicon on a creature, basically. Giving it Ward, especially when it's colorless. So a lot of people, they say, oh, well, Ward is for 60 card formats, where efficient removal is the big thing.
Sure.
I really struggle with that response, because Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile are two of the most played cards in Commander. Like, Commander also is about efficient removal, so Ward plays just as much of a problem, especially when cards like Roaming Throne and Voja are coming down ahead of curve. That's where the issue lies.
They're coming down ahead of curve, which means that they're coming down at a point in the game that Ward 3 is functionally hexproof.
Yes, yeah.
Or at the very least, it's Ward time walk yourself, because like you're going to spend your entire turn responding to this thing, and they can then probably just recast it the next turn, and you are now, you've spent your turn and you're down a card and you're back to where you started. I have issues with both the creatures they put it on and the numbers they assign to it sometimes too. Although I will acknowledge it's a tricky balance. Like, I feel like Ward 1 kind of doesn't do anything. Like, it doesn't feel bad paying 2 for your Swords to Plowshares or paying maybe 4 for your Beast Within. Whereas Ward 3 feels backbreaking.
Yeah, well, and that's why I think I like having Ward that isn't a strict mana cost. Yep. That's where I think Ward kind of gets a little bit more flexible, and I wish they would have leaned into that more, because you have cards like Cults of the Absolute, which is, it gives your commanders Ward pay 3 life as an alternative, And like basically makes every removal spell Anguished Unmaking.
Right.
That's totally doable.
Yeah.
That's not outside the realm of something that like you can't interact with. Whereas you have cards like Forge, Neverwinter, Charlatan, which is ward, sacrifice a creature, which that's very easy to do. It's very easy to instantly make creatures. You have mana dorks, you have all sorts of different things. But then you have Sauron the Dark Lord, which is ward, sacrifice a legendary creature or a legendary artifact. That's so much more specific and harder to pull off.
And again, it's on a card that probably doesn't need that kind of effect.
Oh, absolutely not. I mean,
yeah,
I get why Forge would have ward, because I mean, there's playing around with the flavor of that.
Yeah.
Sauron the Dark Lord absolutely is a powerful enough creature that you didn't need to give it ward, because at a certain point you hit a tipping point in the scales of power where this card is so powerful, like you have to let players answer immediately. Otherwise, it's just going to take over a game.
Yeah.
And I think that's why you're seeing Voja, it's making such a huge splash just weeks after it being released, because it is such a must answer type of commander. If you get to untap with it, and also it's in red. So like you have haste enablers.
Yeah.
It's a problem type of commander even without the ward. And so putting ward on there just makes it all the more egregious, I think, in a lot of players' minds.
Yeah, and I also don't buy the argument that like, oh, this kind of commander, and we're talking about Volger a lot because it's the most recent version of this.
Yeah,
but like, okay, it doesn't do anything till it comes down, and like you want to be able to be given a chance to like have a full turn to untap with it and use it. And I don't really buy that either. I feel like, you know what, if you want to run a commander that's that powerful, but it takes a full turn to get off the ground and do its thing, then you should build your deck with that in mind, and maybe run a Tamiyo Safekeeping in that list, and or run your Lightning Greaves that give it protection, and build your deck around like not playing that thing until you can keep it safe. I don't think that's an unreasonable ask for something that is going to change the face of the game if you're allowed to utilize it for a turn.
Yeah, well, and so a weird effect that I think has kind of been started to get felt by the player base, and I wonder what you think about this, Dana, because you and I talked about it a little bit a few weeks ago, just offline, just talking in general. But a weird side effect of ward being on all of these must answer type of legends is it's incentivizing players to play more wrath effects. Because say you're trying to target a Myram Sentinel Worm with a generous gift, so that's already 3 mana to cast plus the ward cost of 2. That's 5 mana. That's either time walking yourself, like you said, Dana, or you could just be playing board wipes at that mana value. Yeah. And so do you think that players are going to continue shifting? Because I know that the amount of board wipes in players' decks, that's kind of an issue that the community, I think, waxes and wanes on, because you don't always want to see board wipes after an hour game. And if you're putting more board wipes in there to address the amount of ward legends, I mean, that, to me at least, it seems like that's going to be detrimental on the player experiences at a certain point.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance, because I also don't feel like, because that is right, the answer to ward for the most part is to run more board wipes, which then can create longer gameplay, which no one likes. And so what do you do? Do you just then say, I'm just not going to run more board wipes? And then I feel like you're rewarding people that are running these ward creatures by not running cards that interface with them or like allow you to play defense in the best possible way. There's no really good solution other than to like just not have ward be implemented on creatures that you absolutely have to remove, or you're going to lose a game next turn. I don't know if there's a good solution, because I'm definitely like right now having that inner conversation with myself about like, I probably should put 1 or 2 more board wipes in these decks to deal with these creatures, but I really don't want to do that because I don't want to like prolong how long these games run. So I don't have an answer yet, at least for myself, and how I'm going to handle it.
Yeah, I know for me personally, at least in decks that have access to it, there are some cards that you have that can scale, like Soul Shatter.
Yeah.
That's a card that I've loved for a long time, but 2 and a black for an instant speed, which is the big thing. It's instant speed, so you can react to a Voja. Each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker with the highest converted mana value among creatures and planeswalkers they control. So it's able to hit something that's very valuable. Crackling Doom, similar type of effect there. But also, those are very color restrictive too. Like you're either playing black or a Mardu deck specifically for Crackling Doom. So yes, there are some answers, but what is Mono Green going to do about a Voja popping down or an Izzet deck? Like, you kind of have to react pretty quickly Otherwise, you're kind of hosed.
Yeah, you have less option for board wipes in some colors. I mean, some colors have the option of like running a couple spells that can't be countered effects on baked into the spell, which gets around the ward effect as well. But like again, that's only a couple spells, only in more or less blue.
Yeah, very few and far between for sure.
Yeah, and I've been taking a look at like adding a couple more of those to my decks just to interact with ward. So I definitely, it's something that I'm at least pondering what changes I'm going to make to decks to deal with. Now, maybe this will be a thing where, because design has a lag.
Yeah.
They'll release cards and like if they see a problem, it does take some amount of time for them to catch up to that because they're working so far ahead. We could be in a situation right now where like in a year or 2 years, we just are no longer seeing ward showing up the way it's showing up on a Volja level card. And maybe it becomes a minimal issue because there's really only a few commanders where it's a problem. So I guess we'll wait and see. But if things continue this trend, I'm absolutely going to have to run different cards and make a few changes to decks to be able to interact with it for sure. And I would bet I am not the only one.
Yeah, I have seen people saying, we'll just play more removal that can't be countered. But like you said, Dana, if we do start getting those, especially in other colors that aren't blue, black, some variation of that, we're not going to get that for at least another year because ward's been around for a while. They're really starting to introduce it. So any any lessons that are being learned at the moment, those aren't going to be put into place for a little bit yet. And that's where I'm like, okay, we know the solution, but we don't have that because Wizards hasn't given us answers to ward in more colors than just black.
And that also impacts then other formats. You talked about ward being designed for other formats, maybe, and how it does impact EDH. Well, that goes both ways. If they start releasing more removal spells that can't be countered, well, that affects other formats too that they have to keep an eye on. And they don't want those to bleed in too far to the point where it like neuters some of Blue's abilities.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of like interconnected, chaos theory things here happening in like putting ward on stuff makes you run more board wipes. Well, if you start putting more can't be countered things, and that affects other things as well. So there's a lot of plates being spun simultaneously, and I'm not entirely sure where they're going to all come down.
Yeah, and keep in mind too, this isn't a shot. This whole episode is not a shot at the design team at all. They are doing an absolutely fantastic job, and they have kind of an unenviable job where they're trying to keep so many different player types happy all at the same time. And this isn't us necessarily saying we personally believe specific things about it. I think you and I both agree that like ward has gotten a little out of hand, but we're also trying to kind of shed light on like what the community's been saying lately, just kind of a response to a lot of big time conversations that have been going on lately, especially like I said about ward specifically.
Yeah, like I'm sure if you go back 5 years, you'll find some Twitter discourse on how much everyone hates hexproof showing up on like strong cards.
Sure.
Geist to Saint Draft or something. I guess that's more like 10 years, but like I'm sure you would definitely see those things. And so design has moved away from, using hexproof to ward. And I don't envy their position at all. People are going to always be unhappy. And this stuff is so complicated, it sometimes does take a while to figure out the correct balance for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think we both can agree. Ward, it's cool, but to stop putting it on cards that don't need ward. That's my takeaway.
100%. I'm there with you, and maybe put things on ward that aren't just paying mana too. A little more of that I would like to see.
Yeah, I like that execution. I hope that is something, even if it's something like discard a card, something like that like most of the time you're going to have a card in your hand. Like it stinks, but it's also a way to pay some sort of extra cost. Yeah. So, okay. So the next trend that we've noticed, Dana, and this is one that I know that you specifically put it in the show notes, but it's keywords within keywords. It's something that they did, I know, in Lost Caverns of Ixalan. They had keywords within keywords, or they had keywords that were pretty much like the same thing as a previous keyword, either whether it's how they sound, but it actually functions super different, or just keywords that are all doing the same thing. There's a lot of different layers to this, but what are you thinking about all these keywords and just all the overlap that seems to be going on?
I think we need to have like whoever edits the show throw up a little splash right now of Exhibit doing the, yo dog, I heard you like a keyword in your keyword. Will I put a keyword in your keyword? Right now it could be up on the screen. Yeah, the example of this I think of is how map tokens make you explore. And for someone who's been around a long time and played a lot of Magic, that isn't necessarily that complicated. But man, does it feel weird? And I feel like that's a lot for a new player to grok. Oh, okay, I'm making this token that I have to draw on an infinite token or whatever it winds up being. And then I can spend mana to sacrifice it to do a keyword that isn't written anywhere in the card, that, like, whose explanation isn't written on the card. So to figure out how that works then too.
Yeah, well, I think the last time that I ever actually used one of the official tokens was when I was using the playtester. I was on Architect, I was playing around, and something just casually made a map token. So I was like, okay, I actually know what a map token does, but I very rarely do I have actual tokens that have all the keywords, anything like that on there, unless it's from a precon. And so for me, I agree. Putting a keyword on a specific unique token like map tokens, it is putting a lot on players that maybe they're newer. That's my biggest obstacle, is that the new player experience being layered upon layered with different keywords. It gets a lot. Or another example from Lost Caverns of Ixalan, descend versus descended are two different things. And I could see that being incredibly frustrating for a new player that this is their first set, they're doing their first draft. Okay, well, I descend, and that means I did this, and it's actually different. Yeah,
like in a similar vein, I think I like most of the different dual face cards we've gotten over the years. I like the mechanic in just a general sense of having like two different things on a face of a card. But we've got half a dozen at this point different ways those cards function. Some of them exile themselves when they transform. Some of them are ones where you can cast either side depending on what you want to do. Some of them are just flipped based on a trigger. Some of them you can flip based on a thing you do. That is a lot to keep track of. Even as a veteran player, I oftentimes have to go look when you're doing something with a dual face card. I'm like, okay, is this one going to, is this an exile one? Because that's going to make a difference, generate an enter the battlefield trigger, and it's going to give me a chance to do something. Or is it like a battle where you're casting it when you flip it? Okay, well, now I can technically counterspell that.
Yeah.
Like having so many different versions of that and having to more or less check every card every time is a lot. And that's for someone who's been playing a lot of Magic, let alone a new player.
Yeah, well, and Battles is a really good example because on so many of our flip cards before, they just transform. They don't change zones. They don't do anything. Whereas Battles, they flip over and you cast the backside of them. Like you said, there's a chance for interaction that like maybe new players don't really know that, or established players, like this is the first time seeing a battle because they're not terribly popular in Commander, I know. So yeah, it's just how they're functionally doing the same thing, but the way that they're doing it is very, very different because there's a gap either in how the execution is specifically done with like flipping cards. Right. So it's frustrating to see, oh, well, actually this one just transforms, but this one actually goes face down and becomes something else. There's a lot of layers, and Magic is a super complicated game anyways.
Yes.
And so having minute differences that make a huge difference, that's something I think maybe needs to stay on the radar.
Yeah. And at the very least, it's the kind of thing where like, then don't continue to add variance on that, right? Like I understand there's going to be some situations where the way battles work as a concept, you need to have them be cast. And I do like that gives you an inflection point too. If you are playing defensively, it lets you counterspell that battle. I think that's very useful. But let's not start adding like a battle that works differently because we've already had MDFCs that do just transform versus ones that exile versus ones that cast. Like just keeping it simple and trying to focus on not adding a new variant would be something I would definitely appreciate in that regard. And in general, just avoiding like nesting keywords in keywords and avoid keywords that sound the same, especially in the same set.
Well, and yeah, Dana, you talk about different mechanics that are doing kind of the same thing, but doing it differently and giving a completely different name. Let's talk about Morph, and then Megamorph, and then Manifest, which are all effectively kind of doing the same thing. But now you have Cloak, so you can cloak cards from your hand, which is something new that we got in Murders at Karlov Manor, where you get to put a creature or put a card face down as a 2/2, so it's effectively a Morph, but also has Ward 2, so there's Ward again. It's just adding all these different layers. So now you have to know which is a Manifest. You have to know which is a Morph. Now you have to know which one has been cloaked. Whereas putting cards face down, like there's a lot to keep track of. And it's just, I understand that the design team has a lot of plates being spun, as you put it, Dana. But it's also adding unnecessary layers of complication just for the sake of doing it. I feel like that's pressure that isn't coming from the design team. I think that's pressure that they're feeling for sure. But man, is it especially when you get to Commander. Commander's just not a friendly place to instruct new players on how to play Magic anyways. And so having it as a place where all this is meeting together, it makes for a very complicated board state.
And I think this is a lot of this stuff, but particularly the overlapping keywords and just the amount of text on cards is just a logistical issue.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you look back, 2014 or something, and we'd have a core set that would come out and, the 3 different Tarkir sets that year, and that would be it. Like,
yeah.
So it's pretty easy when you're only designing. I shouldn't say easy, but like it's much easier to design, 18 keywords a year for those 4 sets you're putting out than it is to try to design, 40 some keywords for the 9 sets you're putting out in a single year without having some overlap or not even keywords, without having just overlap in the text on cards. And if you're trying to differentiate all those cards when you're making 3 times as many as you were a decade or so ago, I don't know how you avoid that. So like that's just the result, I think, of them making so much product.
Yeah, I also think that that's probably one of the biggest things is just there's so much product out there. They have to keep up with new stuff eventually. Yeah. And so, yeah, just it's one of those after effects that sadly, I think kind of deters, or at least not deters, has a direct impact on player experience. And that's kind of stinks. But
regardless, you can still just make sure you don't name Descend and Descended so similarly in the same set. Like that error is one that I think you can avoid, even if they are kind of painted in a corner regarding how many words they need to put on cards, given how many cards they make in a year.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so we've got a little bit more to talk about, but we need to actually challenge the stats. I know Joey's not here to keep us on the rails, but we can prove to Dad that we don't.
We're adults. We can do this.
We can stay on rails. So real quick, let's get to challenge the stats. It's one of our favorite segments because there is a lot of data on EDHREC and we don't always agree with it. So let's take a quick moment to challenge the stats and get back after this. Well, I'll get us started with challenge stats this week, and mine is actually pretty simple, but it's also on one that this card, it's from the new Fallout set, and I'm super excited. I love the Fallout series, and Idolized is one of my favorite cards from this set. It's 1 and a white for an enchantment aura that says Enchanted Creature. Enchanted Creature has, whenever this creature attacks alone, it gets +X until end of turn, where X is the number of non-land permanents you control. So that's pretty powerful. You see it on a lot of the top commanders already, stuff like Rafik of the Many, Ural the Miststalker, kind of some old classics really that are getting updated because they're usually the only creature or the only creature you want attacking. But I think that Idolized has a chance to shine in any deck that's really leaning heavy into the clue theme. There's so much really cool stuff there. There's cards like Inquisitor Greyfax, Sophia Dog Detective, which they might be putting other creatures on there, but if you want to attack with 1 and really just get a huge payoff for all these clues, all those tokens that you're making out there, Idolize is a fantastic way to do that. Fallout's been out for a few weeks now, and man, it's just really got a chance to shine. And I think people, even though they've been able to brew with this card for a little bit, they really haven't latched onto it for some reason. And I think Idolized, but beyond the flavor success that I think Idolized is, it's a powerful card too. If you only have one creature you want to be swinging with, if it's hard to block, stuff like that, Idolized is fan-freaking-tastic. I love it. It's a way to just, again, convert all that value. If you're a clue deck, you're a treasure deck, whatever, you're able to convert all of that value that you're building up. And I know like Doctor Who decks, there's a lot of the clue making that goes on in those precons too. So if you need a card that's going to help you turn the corner and really close the game out, Idolized is a great way to do that. It's not even in 3,000 decks yet. I expect that number will take off once more people start getting more cards in their hands, but it's not really having a great showing so far, and I think that needs to change.
Yeah, that's a very cool card, and it's one of those ones where I saw it, I'm like, okay, I need to put that in a deck. I don't know what deck I want to put it in yet, but like it's definitely going somewhere for sure.
Yeah, everybody has a deck that can play it. So, well, Dana, what about you and your challenge?
My challenge this week is brought to us by listener Eleanor Shuttleworth, which is a very Benedict Cumberbatch.
Very proper, very
name.
proper.
Eleanor Shuttleworth, that is a fantastic name. Eleanor's suggestion here for challenge of stats is for Atla Palani Nest Tender, and it's for the card Altar of Bone. Altar of Bone is a very old card from way back in Ice Age, and it has not had a reprint really anywhere since then. It's 2 mana for sorcery, a white and a green, and it says sacrifice a creature to search your library for a creature card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle. So basically, it's a tutor effect for a creature that lets you or forces you to sacrifice a creature to do so. It's only in 200 of the 13,000 Atla Palani decks that are currently in the EDHREC database. And why it's so good there is because of the way Atla Palani works, making those egg tokens. When you sacrifice them, you reveal cards from top of your library until you reveal a creature and put that into play. So it kind of does a polymorph-ish effect, but you're kind of doing double duty here. You're sacrificing one of those egg tokens to get the effect while also tutoring a creature to hand at the same time. It's a really good bit of synergy for a card that's relatively cheap for a creature tutor. You can buy it for about $4 right now. Yeah, it should be in way more Atla Palani decks for sure. I would guess, Eleanor, the reason it's not is, like I said, it has not had a printing since way back in Ice Age. So the card's just 25 years old at this point, and most folks probably don't know it exists. But if you were playing Atla Palani and you want a way to sacrifice one of those tokens while also tutoring a creature, Ultra Rebellion would be a fantastic include.
Yeah, it's just such an old card.
Yeah.
I think people just forget about it. It's not going to show up in very many searches. You have to be looking for something fairly specific.
Yep.
But if you just need a budget version of Worldly Tutor, of Sylvan Tutor, you have that right there. The Altar of the Bone is a great budget. It's weird saying that a card that old is a budget replacement, but here we are.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, let's get back to the main topic then. So we got another topic that we've kind of noticed, another trend that we're not sure how we feel about it. We mentioned it a few times just over the course of the podcast over the past few years. We talk about every set since Strixhaven has been Strixhaven. Cards have so much text on them these days. It's kind of overwhelming, and it's hard for me to keep up. And I don't know about you, Dana, but I'm struggling.
Yeah, it's funny. I think it was you that mentioned this, because we just had a switch from Enters a Battlefield to Enters on cards. So like moving forward, it's just going to say Enters, and that's not going to make there be less text on cards. It's just going to free up room to add more text onto cards, basically.
Yeah.
But yeah, we talked about this before the Challenge of Stats a little bit, but I think a lot of this is just the fact that they are making so many cards in a single year, and the only way to differentiate them is to just put a lot of words on the existing cards. I mean, like, I think this is just, they're a victim of their own success in a lot of ways. This is all you can really do when you've tripled or quadrupled the amount of new cards you're releasing in a single year.
Well, Dana, I know that you've said this before, but I've coined the term the Shelob effect, where you take the top half of a card, and that's a perfectly fine card, and then you look at the bottom half of the card, and that would be a perfectly fine card.
Oh, there's more.
But then you put them together on one specific creature or one card or whatever, and then you have just like something that just, there's a keyword soup sometimes, where it used to be, you talk about, Cathrol decks are keyword soup all over the place, but like every card is that now.
And, we talked about how, you complain about Ward, but like 10 years ago, folks would have been complaining about Hexproof, and so they fixed it, and we're still complaining. Like, I distinctly remember, 10-ish years ago or something, when like Core 2013 came out or whatever, and I was going through the full list of cards. I'm like, oh, there's only 2 cards in this set I want. I wish they would print more interesting stuff. And now they're printing more interesting stuff, and like, you're like, oh, there's just too much of the interesting stuff. So it's a can't-win situation for Design. We are going to complain a little bit no matter what. I recognize they are in a very difficult position. But nonetheless, there's just a lot of words on cards, and it makes it difficult to number one, like, it's really easy to miss what the card does. We've all run into that lately. I always think of Sphinx of the Second Sun, where you're trying to parse exactly the sequencing on when you get to take that extra upkeep effect there at the beginning of your turn. Like, you get weird wording, or you just forget which of the 9 key abilities are on Questing Beast or something. Even if you read it, like, it's not even just a matter of you can read the card, and there's just so many things it does that 30 seconds later, you've forgotten what all of that text is on that card. It just makes an already complicated game that much more complicated. Yeah.
Well, and two, I think where I have seen it the most and probably felt it is the complexity of the cards on just at the common rarity even. We used to see charms and modal spells that were only printed at uncommon. I remember listening to a Drive to Work episode by Mark Rosewater where they were talking specifically about at common, we want to keep everything accessible. We don't want to give players too many decisions. We want to keep it simple and elegant and straightforward. Well, now you look at cards at common, like Pick Your Poison that came out in Murders at Karlov Manor, or Return from the Wilds from Wilds of Eldraine. Those are modal cards that are being printed at common that we used to, like years ago, we never saw this. And I think this is a very good point to what you were saying, Dana, where, you know, we want cool and interesting cards, but now there's so many cool and interesting cards, but they're just getting forced their way down to uncommon. But it's causing a lot of decision paralysis among new players and people just at every point in the game too, where it's going to slow down because you have to think ahead. Okay, well, now I have 2 modes that I have to pick from on this card, whereas it used to be just restricted to uncommon and rarer. So even card complexity is being moved down to common. And that's where I think it kind of narrates this point where just there's so much going on every single card.
Yeah, like if I'm going to do an impulse draw in red, I have to check that specific card every time to see if is that impulse this turn, or is it let me play the card before the end of next turn? And I have to look and see, is it a cast effect where I can only cast spells, or is it a play effect so I can use lands out of that too? And there's no hard and fast rule about what the particular impulse draw effect is going to be. So you have to double check on every single one of those to see which of the 3 variants of that impulse draw effect that's going to be, because it's going to be different for every single one.
Yeah, it would be nice if we could get some sort of uniformity among all those types of effects. Like if you're an impulse draw, it's always until your next turn, and it's always cast, for example. And so you can't use lands, something like that. But it does seem to change from card to card too. So just, I agree, yeah, having some uniformity, and granted, maybe that makes where, you know, they have design space to play around too. Maybe that is one of the levers that they like to have. And so, yes, it's needed to have the differences there. So I understand why they don't want to keyword something like that. But also it just, again, it slows down the game a little bit. You're rereading cards to make sure you're understanding which one this is specifically. And especially if you're doing multiple different versions of that in the same turn, then you have to kind of create, you can't just have a separate pile of, these are the cards I exile that I can play. No, it's actually, these are the ones I can't play until next turn. And however you need to organize that out. There's a lot of different tweaks. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before with the differences between flip cards, whether it's a transform or it exiles and you recast the back end.
Yeah, it's in addition to the amount of words, I think one of the things we've seen is, I feel like I don't know how you describe it, maybe skipping a step in terms of like power upgrades. And the first example that always pops up to my mind here are the triomes. So the triomes are an upgrade over the original series of tap lands because they're fetchable. They have all 3 of the land cycles, so you can go fetch them with a fetch land, fetch them with like a green land search. They will impact things like your Cabal coffers because, you know, the swamp versions are swamps, whatever. There's multiple ways that those are upgrades over the previous tri-land cycle. And they have cycling. So like the first real upgrade to those tri-lands wasn't a upgrade, it was kind of a double upgrade. It has 2 things that make it better than the previous version. You look at something like Farewell.
Whoa.
Farewell is absolutely a bomb card. Farewell didn't need to also exile. It could have just destroyed stuff, or it could have forced you to like pick limited modes. But instead we got this thing that was a significant bump over, say, Merciless Eviction or Austere Command or something.
Sure.
It wasn't just an upgrade or a side grade that made you make an interesting choice. It was just a better version of that thing. So that's one of the things with like all these more addition of words on cards too, is I think they're starting to skip ahead even of where they could in eliminating design space kind of by not printing that triumph without cycling, and then later on printing a version that maybe did have cycling but only had 1 land type or something. Like they're getting ahead of themselves, it feels like sometimes. Yeah,
Dana, I remember when Triomes were first previewed back in Ikoria, somebody told me, oh, they previewed a land that does this, this, and this. And I was like, there is no way that's a real card. This is so much better than so many things that currently exist. Well, and it turns out like I had egg on my face, and they actually did print them. And I agree that it's a really good way. And I'm glad that you said it this, where they're skipping a level. They're getting ahead of themselves. They have levers and they're just kind of pushing everything forward. Whereas they could have just done triomes, they could have done tri-lands that cycle, or given the basic land types, anything like that. There's so many different ways, and they just kind of pushed everything over where they're skipping generations in what they should be doing for the sake of getting more packs sold. And again, that's pressure that the design team is feeling. That is not something that is their own fault.
Yeah, I guarantee there's a lot of pressure from up above to like make sure things are really appealing to the player base, and what's appealing to the player base is often things that are powerful. 100% get that. We just wind up within weird things where like I don't think Farewell deserves to be banned. Like, it's a super powerful card, and while I find it annoying, like, I understand why it exists, and there's other formats too. Farewell maybe needed to exist so it can like solve some problems that were in standard, whatever. I get all of that. It just feels frustrating to like have that card that could have been pulled back a notch or two and still be more than playable.
I think if you would have had Farewell be only 2 modes, just kind of a mono-white version of Merciless Eviction that still exiles, that would have been a perfectly powerful card, and it still would have been just as played. The fact that it's all modes there, in my mind, now I know, Dana, you said you don't think Farewell needs to be banned. I think Farewell is doing a lot of bannably powerful things. If I look at Sway of the Stars and I look at some of those cards that have been banned because they are just a hard reset on games, Farewell is doing a lot of those. Now, it doesn't do anything with your hands, but again, comparing it to stuff like Sway of the Stars, where it's a hard reset and it makes it so a lot of what's been happening in the game just doesn't matter leading up to this point. Farewell is kind of doing that. Now, I don't think, again, that Farewell needs to be banned, but it's doing things that cards that are banned currently are also, well, capable of doing in games.
It definitely makes people groan when they see it. Like, that's almost always a universal response, for sure. And part of the reason is because there's just too many words on that card, or at least not enough restrictions within the words that are on it, definitely.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny you say the word restrictions specifically, because Mark Rosewater always loves to say restrictions breed creativity. I don't see a lot of restrictions on some recent cards lately, and that's whether it's Voja or Farewell. It's a lot of these cards that we've been talking about. I think it kind of all boils down to there isn't a ton of restriction that's been, it's been, okay, how far can you push things? Let's just like see what we can get away with. And I know that's kind of assigning intent, and that's not fair to the design team again, but it does feel like there are no rules anymore because there's just a lot of pressure they're feeling from up above.
Yeah, I think there's an element of, I think one thing that WotC did a pretty good job of for a whole lot of years was giving players what they needed versus what they wanted.
Yep.
Because those aren't always the same thing. And it's not to say the players don't maybe sometimes have a better idea of what the game needs to do than the design. Like, they can. I'm not saying they're always wrong or something, but like, those two things don't always overlap. And sometimes designers have a better idea of what is good for the game, and like what levers they don't want to pull or what they want to hold back on than the players might think is good for the game. Because we've talked about this plenty of times where like, oh, I wish this card was a little bit better, and then we get the better version of that card and we're like, oh, I guess we did wish this card was a little bit better, you know?
Yeah.
And I think the last few years, one of the problems to a degree is design has moved a little bit away from that maybe parental role. I'd be like, I don't know if you guys need to have this, to like giving the players what they want. And I think some of that, and I think we've done that. Like, we've said, I wish they would do this, and then we've got it. So I think that's part of it. They're giving us what we want, and maybe what we want isn't necessarily what we need.
I know you love to say, we need to get our veggies. We don't need ice cream all the time because it's not actually good for us. Maybe we are in a little bit of a season where designers said, I'm putting my hands up. I surrender. You asked for this, and this is what we're reaping. What we as a community have sowed.
No, for sure.
That very well could be the case. And so, yeah, it is such an, like I said, unenviable job that the designers have, because
absolutely,
it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't type of situation. And I again, the design team overall is doing a fantastic job, but we just want to take an episode and just kind of make some observations, give some light to different conversations we've been seeing from the community, and kind of just give our own thoughts on maybe how we've kind of gotten here.
Like, one thing I've often heard is it's easy for players of games to identify problems, but it's way harder for them to identify solutions.
Yep.
And so like, we can pick these out, but like, maybe our suggestions make no sense, or our solutions aren't doable too. Like, it's easy to pick out the little things, but much more difficult to actually come up with an implementable way to fix them. So yeah, I do not envy people at WotC who make these cards with what they have to go through to try to make this crazy complex game as balanced as they can.
All right. Well, yeah. Well, let's wrap it up then. I don't have a whole lot else to say, but it was fun getting to talk about this, kind of getting to take a look at some different trends that have been going on in the community. But we are going to wrap it up here real quick. So you can, everybody, find me on pretty much any social media platform at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, we are proud members of Team Ultimate Guard. So if you want some of the best deck boxes, sleeves to protect your card, anything like that, you have a great collection of Magic cards. Why not protect it with Ultimate Guard? So make sure you check them out as well.
And you can find me online at Dana Roach. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald. And you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And don't forget, you can find Joey over at Joseph M. Schultz on pretty much any social media platform as well, on Twitter, Instagram, anything like that. And also a big shout out to Chase Mana Curves over on Twitter as well for doing post-production work as well. Make sure you check them out online as well. But we're going to wrap it up. That does it for us this week. So thank you, everyone. Thanks, Dana, for hanging out, getting to chat a little bit.
Yeah.